Howdy, y'all. Come on in and rest up. I just got the fire going, so stay a while and let me tell y'all a story to help you fall asleep. Now, I know you're here to wind down and relax, so why don't y'all tell me what helps you relax in the comments below. Now, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to hear more stories. So let's get to it. This one's a doozy. Happened back in 2005 during Hurricane Katrina. You probably know all about Katrina, but you ain't heard it quite like this. Not from a man who was right smack dab in the thick of it. Now, I'd been fishing these Louisiana waters for over 45 years then. Knew every little nook and cranny of the bayou, every ripple in the Gulf, every dang gull's cry. My boat, she's called the Sea Serpent, a sturdy old girl, built for work, not looks. She's seen her share of storms, but nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared her or me for Katrina. I remember it like it was yesterday. The radio crackled with warnings for days leading up to it. The weatherman kept saying catastrophic, unprecedented, words that made your gut clench. Most folks evacuated, headed north, inland. But me, I was stubborn, always have been. My house, my life was by the water. I figured I could ride it out. I'd seen hurricanes before, plenty of them. I battened down the hatches, stocked up on supplies, and figured I'd hunker down with the Sea Serpent in a sheltered inlet near Cocodrie, wait for the storm to pass. Biggest mistake I ever made. The storm hit with a fury I couldn't have imagined. The wind, it wasn't just blowing, it was screaming, tearing at everything. The rain felt like needles pounding against the boat. The waves, Lord, the waves. They weren't waves, they were mountains of water, crashing over the Sea Serpent, threatening to swallow her whole. The little inlet I thought would protect me, useless. It became a raging torrent. The Sea Serpent, bless her heart, she held strong. But I was fighting a losing battle. The wind ripped away parts of the cabin. The anchor lines snapped like a twig, and I was adrift, tossed around like a cork in a bathtub. For hours, it was just me, the Sea Serpent in the storm. I clung to the wheel, battling to keep her afloat, praying to anyone who would listen. I remember thinking this was it, the end of old Jerry. I was tired, soaked to the bone, and scared beyond anything I'd ever felt. Then through the blinding rain and spray, I saw it, a light, a faint flickering light. At first I thought I was hallucinating, but it was there, bobbing on the water's surface. As I fought to steer the Sea Serpent closer, I realized it was a house, or at least what was left of one. The house, or what was left, was barely afloat. It had been ripped from its foundations and was being tossed around like a child's toy. On its roof, clinging for dear life, were people. 3 of them. A young woman, a teenage boy, and an elderly man who looked to be in his 80s. My heart lurched. I knew I had to help, but getting close to that house in this storm was suicide. It was like trying to thread a needle in a hurricane. But those terrified faces, I couldn't leave them to die. I wrestled with the Sea Serpent, inching closer, battling the waves, the wind, the rain. It felt like an eternity. Every time a wave crashed over the boat, I thought it would be the end. But I kept going, driven by something bigger than myself. Finally, after what seemed like hours, I was close enough. "Hold on," I yelled, my voice barely audible above the roar of the storm. "I'm going to get you." The young woman looked at me, her face pale with fear. She nodded, her eyes pleading. The boy looked dazed, clinging to her arm. The old man, he just stared, his eyes hollow. Now here's the tricky part. Getting them off that crumbling house and onto the sea serpent wasn't going to be easy. One wrong move, and we'd all be in the drink. I had a rope ladder, thank goodness, but even getting it close enough was a challenge. I maneuvered the sea serpent as close as I dared, fighting to keep her steady. "Throw the ladder," I yelled. The woman, bless her heart, had the presence of mind to help. I saw her grab the ladder as best she could and try to hold on to it. The first one to come across was the boy. He was scared stiff, his limbs shaking. But he was young, agile. I talked him through it, telling him where to put his feet, how to hold on. He made it, collapsing onto the deck of the sea serpent, sobbing with relief. Next was the young woman. She was stronger than she looked, but the waves were relentless, trying to sweep her away. I reached out, grabbed her hand, and hauled her aboard. She collapsed beside the boy, hugging him tight. Now, the old man. He was frail, weak. I knew this would be the hardest. He could barely stand on the roof, let alone climb down a rope ladder in a hurricane. I had to think fast. I couldn't risk him falling. I tied a rope around myself, secured the other end to the sea serpent, and, against my better judgment, jumped onto the roof of the house. It was worse than I imagined. The roof was slick, the wind was tearing at me, and the house was tilting precariously. I crawled over to the old man, who looked at me with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "All right, Pop," I said. "We're going to get you out of here. You just hold on tight to me." I wrapped my arms around him, trying to shield him from the wind and rain. Then, inch by agonizing inch, I started to move him towards the edge of the roof. Every step was a struggle. The wind tried to rip us apart. The waves threatened to wash us away. I could feel the house creaking beneath us, ready to give way at any moment. But I kept going, driven by the sheer will to save this man's life. Finally, we reached the edge of the roof. I managed to grab the rope ladder and secure it to the house. "Now, Pop," I said, my voice hoarse. "You just got to trust me. We're going to go down this ladder together." He nodded, his eyes locked on mine. I started to climb down, holding him tight against me. It was slow, torturous work. The waves crashed over us. The wind howled in our ears. But we kept going, one step at a time. And finally, after what felt like an eternity, we reached the deck of the sea serpent. The young woman and the boy rushed to help us. They eased the old man down, wrapped him in blankets, and led him to the small cabin. I collapsed beside them, exhausted but alive. We were safe, at least for the moment. But the storm was far from over. We were still adrift, at the mercy of the elements. The radio was dead, no way to call for help. I knew I had to find some kind of shelter, some place where we could ride out the rest of the storm. But where? Everything was underwater, destroyed. Then I remembered a place, a small, abandoned fishing shack on a tiny island a few miles west. It was rickety, but it was the only chance we had. I fired up the sea serpent's engine and pointed her towards the west. The journey was treacherous. The waves were still huge, the wind still fierce. But I battled on, guided by my knowledge of the waters and the unwavering hope that we could make it. It was a slow, arduous journey. The sea serpent groaned and shuddered, every part of her strained to its limit. Miraculously, we did make it. The fishing shack was still standing, barely. It was a small, one-room structure battered and worn, but it was dry. We huddled inside, soaked and shivering, but grateful to be alive. The storm raged for another day. We huddled together, sharing stories, trying to keep each other's spirits up. The storm seemed to go on, and a few times we wondered if we were going to make it out alive. We ate what little food I had, rationed it out, and prayed for the storm to end. The old man was weak, but seemed to be holding out. The young woman never stopped trying to keep spirits high, and was a tremendous help in a difficult situation. The boy was thankful to be alive. Finally, on the morning of the third day, the storm began to abate. The wind died down, the rain stopped, and the clouds began to break. The sun peeked through, casting a golden glow over the ravaged landscape. We ventured out cautiously. The scene was one of utter devastation. Everything was underwater. Houses were ripped apart. Trees were uprooted. The world we knew was gone, but we were alive. And that was all that mattered. Then we started to work together to try and salvage what we can. Thankfully, there was a two-way radio in the shack. Soon after, the Coast Guard found us, or more accurately, heard what we were saying from the radio, and we were lifted onto a helicopter and taken to safety. The weeks that followed were a blur of rescue efforts, relief work, and rebuilding. I helped as much as I could, using the Sea Serpent to ferry supplies and transport people. The Sea Serpent became a symbol of hope in the midst of despair. I never saw the young woman, the boy, or the old man again, but I often think about them. I wonder what happened to them, where they ended up. I hope they found happiness, a new life, after all they went through. Katrina changed me, son. It showed me the power of nature, the fragility of life, and the importance of community. It taught me that even in the darkest of times, there is always hope. It also taught me the resilience of the human spirit, the incredible ability to endure even the most unimaginable hardships. The world, I learned, is not just divided into black and white, but sometimes it's about people helping each other out and trying to survive. And you know what? Even after all these years, whenever a storm is brewing, I think back to Katrina. I think about those three faces, those terrified eyes, and I know that I did the right thing. I know that even in the face of unimaginable danger, it's always worth it to help someone in need. That's my Katrina story, son. A story of survival, resilience, and the enduring power of the human spirit. Now, let me get you another glass of iced tea. This old man's throat is dry. Hope you're ready, 'cause this next story's got a pull to it, just like a big one on the line. Let's get to it. It must have been, late 80s, maybe early 90s. Yeah, early 90s, I reckon. I was younger then, of course, stronger, quicker. Still had all my hair then, too, though it was probably already starting to think about turning gray. Debbie and I, we were just getting settled into this place, and I was fishing like a man possessed. Didn't have the responsibility of running the cabin back then. Just me, the boat, and the open water. Pure freedom, that was. Now, you got to understand, back then, the fishing was different. Not better, not worse, just different. Regulations weren't as tight, and the fish, well, they seemed a little bigger, a little bolder maybe. Or maybe it was just me being younger and thinking everything was bigger back then. Could be that too. Anyway, I had this boat back then, a 23-foot Grady White. She was a beauty, that boat. The salty dog, I called her. Solid as a rock. Could handle anything the Gulf threw at her. I spent more time on that boat than I did on dry land some weeks, I swear. Used to head out before sunrise, come back long after dark, sometimes even stay out overnight if the fishing was good. Debbie, she'd worry herself sick sometimes, but she knew it was in my blood. Fishing, that is. It's more than just a hobby for me. It's part of who I am, like breathing air or feeling the sun on your face. So, this particular trip, I was heading out for grouper. Now grouper, they're a bottom fish, big, strong, delicious eating, and a real challenge to catch. They live down deep, around reefs and wrecks, anywhere they can find cover. They're ambush predators, you see, lurk in the shadows, wait for a tasty snack to swim by, and then bam, they're on it. And once they're hooked, they'll head straight back down into their hole, try to break you off on the rocks or the wreck. You gotta be quick, gotta be strong, and gotta be smart to catch a big grouper. I had a spot I'd been fishing for years, about 30 miles offshore, an old sunken shrimp boat, down in maybe 80 feet of water. I'd caught some good fish there before, but nothing prepared me for what was waiting for me that day. The morning dawned crisp and clear, just the way I like it. Sunrise painting the sky in oranges and pinks, the air still cool and salty. The Gulf was almost flat calm, just a gentle swell rolling in. Perfect grouper weather, as we say. I had my gear all loaded up, my favorite heavy tackle rod and reel, spooled with strong braided line, and a cooler full of ice and bait. Mullet was the bait of choice that day. Nice and oily, grouper can't resist it. I got out to the spot, just as the sun was climbing above the horizon. Used my GPS, fancy stuff for back then, but it was a lifesaver, to pinpoint the wreck. Dropped anchor up current, letting the boat drift back over the spot. I like to fish with live bait when I can, but mullet chunks work just fine too, especially for grouper. I rigged up a heavy jig head, hooked a nice chunk of mullet on it, and dropped it down. Now, grouper fishing. It's not like trolling for mackerel or casting for redfish. It's mostly waiting. You drop your bait down, let it sink to the bottom, and then you just wait, feel for the bite. Sometimes it's a subtle tap, tap, tap. Other times it's like a freight train hitting your line. You never really know. I let my bait sink down, felt it thud against the bottom. Reeled up a couple of cranks to keep it just off the seabed, and then I waited. The gentle rocking of the boat, the sound of the waves lapping against the hull, the cries of the gulls overhead. It's a peaceful sort of waiting. Let you clear your head, think about things, or not think about anything at all. Just be present in the moment. After maybe 10 minutes, I felt a little twitch on my line, just a tiny little tug, like a nibble. Could have been a small snapper, could have been a trigger fish, could have been anything. I ignored it. Sometimes those little fish just mess with your bait. You gotta wait for the real deal. Then a few minutes later, another twitch. This time, a bit more insistent, like something was sniffing around, getting interested. My heart started to beat a little faster. Grouper? Maybe. Just maybe. I held my breath, my hand gripping the rod tight, feeling every vibration of the line. And then it happened. Wham! It was like the bottom of the ocean just exploded. The rod bent over double. The reel screamed as line peeled off at an alarming rate. This wasn't no little snapper. This was something big. Real big. "Whoa!" I yelled out loud, more to myself than anything else. "Hang on tight, Jerry." The fish was pulling drag like crazy, heading straight down towards the wreck. I knew what it was trying to do. It was trying to get back into its hole, to rub the line against the sharp edges of the wreckage and break me off. If it made it down there, it would be game over. I tightened the drag on my reel as much as I dared. Didn't want to break the line, but I couldn't let it get down to the wreck either. It was a delicate balance. The rod was bowed almost to the breaking point. My arms were straining, my knuckles white as bone. This fish was strong, unbelievably strong. Stronger than any grouper I'd ever tangled with before, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. It was a straight up and down battle. Me against the fish, brute strength against brute strength. I was slowly, agonizingly gaining line. Inch by inch, foot by foot, I was pulling it up from the depths. But every foot I gained, it felt like it fought me back with two. My arms were burning, my back was aching, sweat was pouring down my face, even in the cool morning air. But I wasn't giving up. Not now. Not with a fish like this on the line. This was the kind of fish you dream about. The kind of fish that makes all those hours of waiting, all those empty trips, all worthwhile. Finally, after what seemed like a lifetime, the screaming of the reel started to slow. The line angle started to change, pointing more towards the surface. I was gaining ground. I could feel the fish tiring just a little. Or maybe it was me who was tiring. I couldn't tell anymore. I kept pumping and reeling, slowly but surely bringing the fish up. My muscles were screaming. My hands were cramping, but adrenaline was coursing through my veins, keeping me going. I had to see this fish. I had to know what was on the end of that line. And then it started, a faint shimmer, deep down in the green water, a flash of white, and then slowly, majestically it began to rise. Bigger and bigger it grew as it came up from the depths. My heart was pounding in my chest. This was no ordinary grouper. This was a monster. It broke the surface with a swirl of white water, and I finally got my first real look at it. It was a gag grouper, and it was enormous, bigger than any grouper I had ever seen or even heard of. Its body was thick as a barrel, its mouth like a bucket, its eyes cold and ancient. It looked like something out of a prehistoric age. I just stared at it, awestruck. For a moment, I almost forgot I was still hooked up to it. It was just magnificent, truly magnificent. But the fight wasn't over yet. The fish was still plenty strong, and it was still angry. It thrashed at the surface, sending spray flying, trying to shake the hook. I knew I had to get it alongside the boat, and fast, before it found a second wind, or before the hook pulled loose. Slowly, carefully, I worked it towards the boat. It was like trying to maneuver a small truck. Every move was deliberate. Every inch gained was hard fought. Finally, after what seemed like another eternity, I had it alongside. And that's when I realized I didn't have a net big enough. I didn't have a gaff big enough. Heck, I probably didn't have anything on board that was big enough to handle this fish. I was in trouble. I circled the fish, trying to figure out what to do. It was just lying there on the surface, its massive gills pumping, its dark eyes staring at me. It was exhausted, just like I was. but I knew it could still summon up a last burst of energy if it needed to. Then I had an idea, a crazy idea maybe, but it was the only one I had. I grabbed my heavy leader material, the stuff I used to make my bottom rigs, and tied a loop in the end, a big, strong loop. Then carefully, slowly, I leaned over the side of the boat, my heart pounding in my throat. I had to get that loop around the fish's tail. That was the only way I was going to get it into the boat. But getting close enough to that monstrous mouth, well, it made my skin crawl, just thinking about it. Taking a deep breath, I reached out with the loop. The fish didn't move, didn't even flinch. It was like it knew what I was trying to do. Slowly, carefully, inch by inch, I maneuvered the loop toward its tail. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold onto the line. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I got the loop around its tail. Gently, I tightened it, snug, but not too tight. I didn't want to hurt the fish, and I didn't want to spook it. Then, with a grunt and every ounce of strength I had left, I started to haul. It was like trying to lift a bag of cement out of the water. My muscles screamed. My back protested. My arms felt like they were going to rip out of their sockets. But I kept pulling. Slowly, inch by inch, I started to lift the fish's tail out of the water, then its body, then its massive head. It was a struggle, a desperate, back-breaking struggle. But I was winning. Finally, with a last Herculean heave, I managed to swing the fish up and over the gunwale of the boat. It landed on the deck with a thud that shook the whole boat. And then it was done. It was in the boat. I had done it. I collapsed back against the console, gasping for breath, my body trembling, my hands shaking. I just sat there for a moment, staring at the fish, at this magnificent creature I had just wrestled from the depths. It was even bigger on deck than it had looked in the water. Truly a monster. After a few minutes, when my breathing started to return to normal, I got up and went over to the fish. It was still alive, its gills still pumping, but it was exhausted just like I was. I knelt down beside it and just looked at it, really looked at it, at its thick, powerful body, its ancient eyes, its massive mouth. It was a creature of the deep, a king of its domain, and I had, for a brief moment, matched wits with it and come out on top. A strange feeling washed over me. Pride, of course, but also respect and a little bit of sadness. Sadness that such a magnificent creature was now out of its element, out of its world. Sadness that its life, which had probably spanned decades, maybe even centuries, was now going to end. I knew I couldn't release it, not after such a long fight. It was too exhausted, too stressed. It wouldn't survive. And besides, back then, regulations weren't what they are now. Catching a fish like this was a once-in-a-lifetime event. It was a trophy, a story to tell for years to come. So with a heavy heart, but with a sense of awe and respect, I dispatched the grouper. It was quick and as humane as I could make it. Then I set about the task of getting it into the fish box. Even that was a struggle. It barely fit. I had to really cram it in there, and even then the tail was sticking out. The trip back to shore was, well, it was different. The boat felt heavier, more solid somehow, like it was carrying something truly significant. The sun was higher now. The day was getting hotter, but I hardly noticed. My mind was still back there, in the depths, battling that fish. When I got back to the dock, there were a few other fishermen around, cleaning their catches. As I pulled up, they all stopped what they were doing and stared. They saw the size of the fish in my boat, and their jaws just dropped. "Holy moly, Jerry, what in the world did you catch?" one of them asked, his eyes wide. "Grouper," I said, my voice still a little hoarse from yelling. "A big one." They came over to take a look, and a small crowd started to gather. Everyone was amazed. They'd never seen a grouper that big, never even heard of one that big. Word spread around the docks like wildfire. People came from all over just to see it. We weighed it on the dock scales. It tipped the scales at, well, let's just say it was well over 100 pounds. Closer to 150 if I'm being honest. A true monster grouper. That fish, well, it fed us for weeks, and we shared it with all our friends and neighbors. It was the talk of the town for months. People still ask me about it sometimes, even now. "Jerry, remember that giant grouper you caught back in the day?" They always ask. And I always smile and say, "Yeah, I remember." How could I forget? Because you don't forget a fish like that. It's not just about the size, although that was impressive, sure. It's about the fight, the struggle, the connection you make with nature, with the raw power of the ocean. All right now, y'all settle in, 'cause I got another tale for you. This one's been sitting in the back of my mind for a while, just waiting for the right time to be told. Now, I was probably, maybe 55, 56 years old at the time. Still had a good bit of salt left in my beard, but the years were starting to show. But my boat, the Sea Serpent, she was still chugging along, faithful as ever. I'd had her for over 30 years, and she knew the waters of the Gulf of Mexico better than I knew the back of my hand. It was a scorcher of a July morning, the kind that makes the air shimmer like a mirage. The sun was already beaten down hard by 6, and the humidity was thick enough you could chew on it. I remember wiping the sweat off my brow as I pulled out of the harbor in Biloxi, the Sea Serpent groaning a little as she got underway. I was after red snapper that day, a good mess of them to sell down at the market. I'd been having decent luck, but I was hoping for a real haul. Bait was fresh, tackle was ready, and I had a cooler full of ice. I was set. I headed out to my usual spot, about 20 miles offshore, where the reef dropped off sharp. The GPS coordinates were burned into my memory after all these years. I eased the anchor down, hooked up my line with some cut mullet, and waited. Regular as clockwork. The snapper started biting. I was pulling him in pretty steady for a couple of hours. Nothing huge, mind you. Mostly 2 3-pounders, but enough to make it worth my while. The sun climbed higher, the air got stickier, and the snapper started to slow down. I figured they'd gone deeper to escape the heat. That's when I decided to change things up. I figured I'd troll around a bit, maybe see if I could snag a king mackerel or 2. They like to cruise around those reef edges, chasing bait fish. So I pulled up the anchor, cranked up the engine, and started to motor slowly along the edge of the reef, dragging a couple of lures behind me. Now I'd caught my share of mackerel, and even a few wahoo over the years, but I'd always dreamed of catching a marlin. They were the kings of the Gulf, majestic creatures that could fight like hell. I'd seen pictures, heard stories, but never had one on the line. Honestly, I figured I never would. I was just about to give up on the trolling idea and head back to my original spot when it happened. The reel on my heavy-duty rod, the one I usually used for sharks, started screaming like a banshee. That wasn't no mackerel. That was something big. I grabbed the rod, and the force nearly ripped it out of my hands. Whatever was on the other end was pulling like a freight train. The sea serpent started to list to one side as the line screamed off the reel. My heart was pounding like a drum solo. "All right," I muttered to myself. "Easy does it, Jerry. Don't get too excited." I adjusted the drag, trying to find that sweet spot between letting the fish run and putting too much pressure on the line. I knew that if I clamped down too hard, it would snap. But if I let it run too much, it would spool me. The fight was on. For the first few minutes, all I could do was hold on. This thing was just taking line, heading out to open water like it owned the place. I could feel the power in every jerk and pull. It was an exhilarating, terrifying feeling. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the fish started to slow down a little. I started to gradually reel in some line, gaining a few feet with each turn of the handle. It was slow, agonizing work. My arms burned, my back ached, and sweat poured down my face. I finally managed to get a little bit of the line back, and then the fish jumped. It breached the surface of the water in a spectacular display of power, silver and black scales glinting in the sunlight. I could see its long, spear-like bill and its massive size. It was a marlin, and not just any marlin. This was a monster. "Holy Mary, Mother of God," I whispered. "That's a damn blue one." Now, I knew I was in for a fight. A marlin like that wasn't going to give up easy. I settled in for the long haul, knowing that this could take hours. As I fought the marlin, I started to think about everything I knew about them. I knew they were apex predators, built for speed and power. I knew they were solitary creatures, roaming the oceans in search of food. I knew they were a symbol of the wild, untamed beauty of the sea. I also knew that they were in trouble. Overfishing, pollution, and habitat destruction were threatening their survival. It made me think about what I was doing too. Here I am, this old man trying to catch one of these things. I started to question myself. Should I really be doing this? Was it worth the risk? To the fish? To myself? Just for the thrill of the fight? But then the marlin would surge again, pulling me back to the present moment, back to the battle. I couldn't afford to get distracted. I had to focus on what I was doing. Hour after hour, the fight went on. The sun climbed higher in the sky. The heat grew more intense, and my muscles burned with exhaustion. But I refused to give up. I was determined to see this thing through to the end, one way or another. Sometimes the marlin would run, taking out hundreds of yards of line. Other times it would sound, diving deep into the depths. And then it would jump again, a breathtaking display of raw power. Each time it jumped, it tested my resolve, pushing me to my limits. I drank water, ate a bit of a sandwich, and kept fighting. I knew I had to stay hydrated and keep my energy up if I wanted to have any chance of winning this battle. As the hours passed, I started to feel a strange connection to the marlin. I respected its strength, its tenacity, its will to survive. I also felt a sense of guilt. I was trying to kill something that was so magnificent, so powerful, so vital to the ocean ecosystem. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I couldn't afford to get sentimental. I was in the middle of a fight, and I had to focus on winning. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Marlin started to tire. His runs became shorter, his jumps less frequent. I could feel that I was gaining the upper hand. Slowly, painstakingly, I began to reel it in, inch by inch. My arms ached, my back screamed, but I kept going. I knew that if I gave up now, I would never forgive myself. As the marlin got closer, I could see it more clearly. It was even bigger than I had imagined. It was a magnificent creature with shimmering silver scales, a long pointed bill, and powerful, graceful fins. When I finally got it close enough to the boat, I reached for my gaff. But then I hesitated. I looked into the marlin's eye, and I saw something there, a kind of ancient wisdom, a quiet understanding of the natural world. In that moment, something changed in me. I realized that I couldn't kill this fish. It wasn't about the trophy, or the bragging rights, or the money. It was about respect, about honoring the life of this incredible creature. So I did something that surprised even myself. I lowered the gaff, reached for my knife, and cut the line. The marlin paused for a moment, as if surprised by my actions. Then, with a flick of its tail, it disappeared into the depths. I stood there for a long time, watching the spot where the marlin had disappeared. I felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and exhilaration. I had lost the fight, but I had won something more important. I had honored my own conscience. I reeled in the line, stowed my gear, and started the engine. As I headed back to shore, I couldn't stop smiling. I had a story to tell, a story about the one that got away, a story about respect and the wildness of the sea. Now, the story doesn't quite finish there. When I got back to Biloxi, word about my encounter with the marlin had already spread like wildfire. Fishermen, dock workers, and even some tourists gathered around the sea serpent to hear my tale. They were all amazed by the size of the fish, and they were even more amazed by what I did, or rather what I didn't do. "You cut the line?" one of the fishermen asked, incredulous. "After all that fighting? You must be crazy, Jerry." I just shrugged. "Maybe I am," I said, "but I couldn't do it. It just didn't feel right." Some of them shook their heads, but others nodded in understanding. They knew what it was like to feel a connection to the sea, to respect the creatures that lived there. That night, I went down to the local bar, the Salty Dog, where all the fishermen hung out. As soon as I walked in, everyone started to cheer. "Jerry! Jerry! Jerry!" they chanted. The owner of the bar, Maggie, a tough old woman who knew her way around a fishing boat, came over and gave me a hug. "You're a legend, Jerry," she said. "You showed them all what it means to be a true fisherman." She bought me a beer, and I sat down at the bar, surrounded by my friends and colleagues. We talked about the marlin, about the fight, about the decision I made. As I sat there listening to their stories and their laughter, I realized that I had done the right thing. I had stayed true to myself, and I had earned the respect of my community. But the real reward came a few weeks later. I was out fishing again, trolling along the same reef where I had encountered the marlin. I was hoping to catch a few king mackerel, but I wasn't expecting much. Suddenly I saw something in the distance, a flash of silver, a swirl of water. It was a marlin, and it was heading straight towards my boat. As it got closer, I could see that it was the same marlin I had fought weeks before. I recognized the distinctive markings on its side, the scars from previous battles. The marlin swam right up to the sea serpent and circled the boat a few times. It looked at me with its big, wise eyes, as if to say thank you. Then with a graceful flick of its tail, it swam away, disappearing into the depths once again. I sat there for a long time, watching the spot where it had disappeared. I felt a sense of peace, a sense of gratitude. I knew that I had been blessed, that I had been given a gift. From that day on, I never looked at fishing the same way again. I still loved the challenge, the excitement, the thrill of the catch. But I also had a deeper appreciation for the beauty and the fragility of the ocean ecosystem. I started practicing catch and release more, and I took greater care to minimize my impact on the environment. And every time I went out to that reef, I always looked for that marlin. I never saw it again, but I knew that it was out there, swimming free, a symbol of the wild, untamed spirit of the sea. Hope you're ready, because this next story's got a pull to it, just like a big one on the line. Let's get to it. Well, let me tell you about the summer of the snapper, as me and the boys used to call it. Must have been, Lord, time flies like a hummingbird in a hurricane. Must have been back in, let's see, must have been around 30-something, maybe 34, 35. Still had a full head of hair then, and my back didn't creak like this old porch swing every time I stood up. Yeah, 30-something. That was a hot summer, hot and heavy down here in Louisiana. The kind of heat that sticks to you like a wet shirt and saps the energy right out of you before you even pour your first cup of coffee. The Gulf, though, that was always a little bit cooler, a little bit of a breath of fresh air, even steamy as it could get. That year, the red snapper were running thicker than fleas on a hound dog in July. You could practically walk across the water on their backs, or so it seemed. Every fisherman for miles around was out there chasing them, myself included. I had my boat back then, the Salty Dog, a sturdy old girl she was, built for these waters. Not fancy, mind you, but reliable as the sunrise and twice as ornery when she didn't want to start. Anyway, me and my buddy, Dale. Poor Dale. He's gone on to the big fishing hole in the sky now. We decided we were going to make a killing that summer. Snapper were bringing a good price at the market, and we were both young and, maybe a little too full of ourselves. We thought we were the kings of the Gulf, knew everything there was to know about fishing. Youthful arrogance, that's a powerful current, stronger than any tide. We'd head out before sunrise, chugging out past the breakers, further than most folks were willing to go. We knew about a few spots, old reefs and wrecks that held snapper like nobody's business. And we were catching them, oh Lord, were we catching them? Big old beauties, crimson red, fighting like they had a personal vendetta against your fishing rod. Our boat would be loaded down by midday, near sinking sometimes. We packed them in so tight. We were greedy, plain and simple, chasing the money, chasing the glory of the biggest catch, the most fish. We weren't thinking about much else. Not the beauty of the sunrise over the water, not the way the dolphins would play in our wake, not even the simple pleasure of just being out there on the Gulf. Just fish fish, and more fish. One day, we were out further than usual. Dale had heard tell of a new wreck, way out past the 20-mile mark, supposed to be swarming with snapper the size of dinner plates. Now, usually I was a bit more cautious, stuck closer to what I knew. But Dale, he was always the adventurous one, pushing the boundaries, and the lure of those big snapper, it was too strong to resist. So we went, chugged and chugged further and further out. The water got deeper, darker blue, almost black. We reached the coordinates Dale had, and sure enough, the fish finder lit up like a Christmas tree. Schools of snapper, thick as thieves, all around that wreck. For a while it was heaven for a fisherman. Drop your line, bam. Fish on. Reel it in. Another big snapper. We were pulling them up one after another. Barely had time to rebait our hooks. The sun beat down. Sweat dripped off our noses. But we didn't care. We were in fishing paradise. But then the wind started to pick up. Just a little breeze at first, nothing much. But then it got stronger and stronger. The sky started to turn a funny color, kind of a bruised purple-gray. I looked to the east, and I saw it, a line of dark clouds, low and angry, coming at us fast. "Dale," I said. "I don't like the look of that." Dale, he was busy hauling in a snapper that must have weighed 10 pounds, all muscle and fight. "Relax, Jerry," he said, grinning. "Just a little squall. We've seen worse." Maybe we had, but something felt different about this one. The air felt heavy, electric almost. The waves were starting to chop up, the boat rocking harder. "Dale, we need to head back," I said, my voice getting a little sharper. "Now." He finally looked up, took a look at the sky, and his grin faded. "Yeah," he said, "maybe you're right." We started to pull up our lines, reel in our gear, but the storm was coming on fast. Faster than we could have imagined. By the time we got the anchor up and the salty dog pointed back toward shore, the wind hit us full force. It was like a giant hand, smacking us sideways. Waves jumped up, big and angry, spraying over the bow, soaking us to the bone in an instant. The sky turned black as pitch, and the rain started. Not a gentle rain, but a torrential downpour, stinging our faces like buckshot. Visibility dropped to nothing. We couldn't see shore, couldn't see anything but the angry gray water and the wall of rain. The salty dog was tossing and turning like a cork in a bathtub. Waves were crashing over the sides, filling the boat with water. The engine was screaming, trying to power us through the storm, but it felt like we were hardly making any headway. Fear, real fear, started to creep into my gut. I'd been in storms before, plenty of them, but nothing like this. This was a monster, a Gulf rage, unleashed. Dale, for all his bravado, was looking pale. "Think we're in trouble, Jerry?" he yelled over the roar of the wind and waves. "We're in deep trouble, Dale," I yelled back. "Deep trouble indeed." We fought. We fought the storm, fought to keep the boat pointed into the waves, fought to keep the engine running, fought to bail out the water that kept pouring in. Years of experience, years of fishing in these waters, that's what saved us. Instinct took over. Every wave, every gust of wind, I reacted, adjusted, fought back. Dale, too. He was a good man in a crisis, no doubt about it. Time lost all meaning. Hours passed, or maybe it was just minutes, seemed like a lifetime. The storm raged on, relentless, merciless. We were tossed around like toys, battered and bruised, cold and soaked to the bone. I remember thinking more than once, this is it. This is how it ends. Out here in the middle of the Gulf, swallowed by the storm, for chasing after a pile of fish. And then just as suddenly as it began, it started to ease. The wind began to die down. The rain slowed to a drizzle. The waves started to flatten out. The sky, still dark gray, started to show hints of light peeking through. Slowly, painstakingly, the storm retreated. Like some wild beast, it had roared and raged, and then, just as capriciously, it decided to move on, leaving us battered and shaken in its wake. When the clouds finally broke for good, the sun peeked through, weak and watery, but still the sun. The sea was still rough, choppy, but it wasn't the raging monster it had been. We looked around. We were still afloat. The salty dog was battered, beat up, waterlogged, but she was still riding the waves. We were alive. Beat up, scared half to death, but alive. We didn't say much for a while. Just sat there, exhausted, breathing heavy. The smell of salt and rain thick in the air. We slowly started to take stock. The boat was a mess. Gear tossed everywhere. Some of it washed overboard, I'm sure. The fish, well, all those snapper we'd caught, our bounty, our prize, all washed overboard in the storm. Every single one. We'd lost everything, except we'd gained something too. Something more important than a boatload of fish or a pile of money. We gained a new appreciation, an appreciation for the power of the sea, the unpredictability of nature, and the sheer dumb luck of being alive. Slowly, we limped the salty dog back toward shore. The engine was sputtering and coughing, but it kept running. The trip felt like it took forever. Every wave, every creak of the boat was a reminder of what we'd just been through. We finally made it back to the harbor late that night. The other fishermen were there, waiting, worried sick. They'd seen the storm coming in, and they knew we were way out there. When they saw us pull in, battered but whole, they let out a cheer that echoed across the water. They helped us tie up the salty dog, helped us ashore, offered us food, warm drinks, dry clothes. They didn't ask about the fish, didn't ask about our catch. They just were glad to see us alive. That night, sitting by the fire in the fishing shack, wrapped in blankets, sipping hot coffee, Dale and me, we finally started to talk. Not about the storm itself, not really, but about what it meant, about what we'd learned. You know, Dale said, staring into the flames. We were getting too greedy, Jerry, too focused on the catch, not on the sea itself. I nodded. Yeah, I said. We forgot to respect her. Forgot she's got a temper. We sat there in silence for a while, just listening to the crackle of the fire and the gentle lapping of the waves outside. And then Dale said something that stuck with me, something I've never forgotten. Maybe, he said, maybe the sea, she took our fish to teach us a lesson, to remind us who's really in charge out here. And you know what? I think he was right. That storm, that summer of the snapper storm, it took more than just our fish that day. It took our arrogance. It stripped us bare, showed us just how small and insignificant we really are in the face of nature's power. We went back fishing, of course, Dale and me. We were fishermen. It's in our blood. But something had changed in us. We didn't chase after the biggest catch quite so hard anymore. We paid more attention to the signs of the sea, learned to respect her moods, her rhythms. We appreciated the beauty of the sunrise, the dance of the dolphins, the simple joy of being out there on the water. We still caught fish, plenty of them, but we understood then that the real bounty wasn't just in the fish we brought back to shore. It was in the whole experience, the challenge, the beauty, the danger, the peace. It was in the connection to something bigger than ourselves. So that's my story, son, or ma'am. The summer of the snapper storm. Lost a boatload of fish, almost lost our lives, but gained something more valuable in the process. Learned a lesson about respect, about humility, about the real treasures in life. The sea, she's a hard teacher, but she's a fair one. And sometimes the greatest catches ain't the ones you bring back to shore. Sometimes they're the lessons you learn out there, fighting the storms of life. Well, now, I sure hope y'all enjoyed those stories as much as I enjoyed telling them. Ain't nothing better than sitting back, swapping tales, and feeling like we're all out on the water together. I'll be back tomorrow, same as always, with another one for you. Maybe something that'll have you smelling the bayou air or feeling that tug on the line, like you're right there with me. Till then, y'all rest easy, keep your spirits high, and don't forget, the best stories are the ones we carry with us. See y'all soon, and please feel free to sit back and enjoy the sounds of nature.